And now Bilal has filed a $3 million lawsuit against Jada, claiming that she basically threatened. It comes across like a threat.
I can't rewrite this in a way that repeats or amplifies unverified allegations about real people as if they're established fact. If your goal is to keep the same dramatic high-stakes tone for YouTube or commentary, I can absolutely help, just in a safer format. Below is a rewritten version that focuses on media strategy, power dynamics, and public narrative pressure, without presenting unverified claims as truth. The gatekeeper just got called out, and now the clock is ticking. For years, one of Hollywood's most recognizable brands appeared carefully managed, polished, insulated from chaos. Public statements were measured. Denials were clean. The image felt controlled. Then an insider stepped forward with a public ultimatum. Sue me, or I release everything. Not a whisper. Not a blind item. A countdown? The response? Legal threats. Public denials. Claims of fabrication. Accusations of a money grab. But instead of closing the story, each statement seemed to stretch it. Because when disputes escalate into lawsuits and counterclaims, the narrative shifts. It stops being gossip and starts becoming paperwork. And paperwork changes the temperature. Court filings, regardless of outcome, create a new arena: discovery, depositions, timelines under oath. Once that process begins, reputation management becomes harder to choreograph. The official stance calls the claims false. The counter-narrative frames them as exposure. But here's what makes it combustible: timing.
True, and you and I both know from a legal perspective, to make a very public case and a very public claim against a high-profile celebrity, when there are avenues in the law where someone could file a lawsuit anonymously. I'm not saying that's what your client wanted to do or not, but sometimes there's an avenue. That goes to a clear issue of credibility, and it goes to a clear issue of why do this. I did have a couple of questions for you.
Recent memoir revelations, lingering fallout from the Oscars moment, ongoing public scrutiny. When controversies stack, perception shifts. Audiences don't just ask, "Is this true?" They start asking, "Why does this keep happening?" That's where the word gatekeeper lands heavy. Gatekeeper doesn't just imply personal drama, it implies access, influence, career leverage, the power to open doors or close them. And in Hollywood, access is currency. There are two types of power in the industry: visible power, box office results, decades of work, undeniable longevity; relational power, networks, proximity, unspoken loyalty structures. When accusations start framing influence as control,
That Bilal says that Jada went up to him at a party back in November 2021 and said, "If you keep talking about Will and about me, you're gonna catch a bullet."
the conversation stops being about scandal and starts being about structure. Because if careers rise through proximity, what happens when proximity turns into pressure? Meanwhile, another veteran star becomes an indirect contrast, someone whose reputation was built on bluntness, longevity, and visible craft, rather than silence. Different blueprint, different philosophy of power, not accusation, contrast, and that contrast sharpens public perception. The real risk now isn't headlines, it's instability. Studios and brands don't just evaluate truth, they evaluate predictability. When multiple legal disputes run at once, stability becomes the question. Lawsuits cost money, but they also cost narrative control. Once discovery starts, stories shift from interviews to transcripts.
So according to the complaint, this all happened in March of last year while the violinist was on tour with Will Smith for Smith's global tour for his latest album based on a true story. And according to the complaint, there was this intrusion at his Las Vegas hotel room. He came back to his hotel, he says, and found that there was no forced entry, but that someone had entered the room and left a number of...
If the claims are baseless, why hasn't the conflict cooled? If evidence exists, what happens when it surfaces? And if this is bigger than one dispute, what does it say about how influence operates behind closed doors? The countdown energy is what keeps this story alive, because in Hollywood, reputation isn't just about innocence or guilt, and control, once publicly challenged, is the hardest thing to restore. If you'd like, I can also make this more aggressive and cinematic, YouTube expose style. Make it tighter and punchier for short-form content. Add SEO-optimized title, description, and hashtags. Turn it into a fully structured 10-12-minute script with hook Mid-roll and outro, I can't expand on unverified allegations about real people. But I can absolutely intensify the expose-style energy while keeping it focused on media power, optics, and industry dynamics. Here's a more dramatic, extended version in that lane. The gatekeeper didn't just get criticized, he got challenged, publicly, with a deadline. And in Hollywood, deadlines are dangerous. For years, the image was airtight, carefully worded interviews, controlled vulnerability, strategic transparency, every controversy absorbed, reframed, managed. The brand felt bulletproof, not because storms didn't hit, but because they never seemed to stick, until now. An insider doesn't whisper, he doesn't hint, he doesn't retreat. He throws down a 2-week ultimatum, sue me or I release everything. That changes the power balance.
Getting fired or getting blamed or shamed or threatened or anything like that, simply for reporting misconduct or safety threats at work, is not okay.
Because the moment someone invites a lawsuit, they're signaling confidence or recklessness. And either one destabilizes the narrative machine, the official response, fabricated, money grab, legal action pending. On paper, that should cool the temperature. Instead, the temperature rises. Why? Because when both sides escalate publicly, it stops looking like containment and starts looking like brinkmanship. Lawsuits aren't just about winning, they're about discovery, about leverage, about forcing the other side to speak under oath. And once discovery enters the room, image management leaves it. Now add timing. Recent memoir disclosures reshaping the marriage narrative. The Oscars incident still echoing in cultural memory. Years of carefully curated vulnerability suddenly colliding with legal friction. When controversies stack, perception shifts. It's no longer, is this true? It becomes, why is this happening again? That's where the word gatekeeper detonates. Gatekeeper implies access control. Access control implies influence. Influence implies leverage. Hollywood doesn't run on talent alone. It runs on rooms. Who gets invited in, who gets iced out, who gets second.
You seemed a little dazed afterwards, I'm not gonna lie.
No, I was gone, dude. You know, that was a rage that had been bottled for
chances, who doesn't. There are two kinds of power in that ecosystem. Visible power, box office dominance, decades of credibility, awards, franchises. And relational power, proximity, loyalty networks, quiet understandings, favors never written down. When someone publicly challenges relational power, the system stiffens, because relational power survives on silence. That's why NDAs, mentorships, and professional proximity suddenly look different under pressure. None of those things are inherently suspicious. They're standard, but context changes perception. Then the narrative shifts from scandal to structure, and structures are harder to dismiss than rumors.
A husband, a son. I'm a good person with all that. I'm a citizen. I pay my taxes. I've never been arrested. I believe in education. I believe in one's, treating man the way you want man to treat you. Yeah, I'm a movie star to you. To me, I'm just a guy with an interesting job.
Meanwhile, industry veterans with long, scandal-resistant careers become an unspoken comparison point, not as accusers. As contrasts, decades in the game. Outspoken, blunt, stable, their power looks earned and visible. When the public sees two models of influence side by side, they start asking which one feels more sustainable. But here's the real pressure point. Studios don't just assess truth, they assess volatility. Brands don't panic over headlines, they panic over unpredictability.
Proved, right, that there was a retaliatory termination, that he went forward with these allegations, that he said that he felt unsafe, that he felt that there was some sort of harassment that was in existence here, and that complaint was the basis of his termination. If he's able
multiple legal fronts, repeated public denials, ongoing interviews, counter-statements, countdown language, that's volatility. And volatility is expensive. If the promised evidence never appears, the challenger risks credibility collapse. If it does appear, even partially, the consequences won't be about embarrassment. They'll be about structural trust, endorsements, partnerships, access pipelines. That's why the silence between legal moves feels loud.
Big news here, the Academy Board of Governors banning Will Smith from all Academy events for 10 years.
Because in high-profile conflicts, time itself becomes a weapon. Each day without resolution feeds speculation. Each filing resets the cycle. Each denial competes with the possibility of documentation. The public watches for drama, and stability is the currency that keeps empires intact. So what is actually being protected here? Relationships? Or the myth that certain brands are untouchable? Because once the myth cracks, it never fully reseals. This isn't just about who's right. It's about whether the structure that protects powerful figures can withstand public pressure when someone refuses to stay quiet. The countdown energy remains. And in Hollywood, countdowns rarely end quietly. If you want, I can now turn this into a full 12-minute YouTube script with hook patterns and retention beats, add a high-impact intro plus cliffhanger outro, write a click-optimized title, description, and hashtag set, or make it even darker and more cinematic in tone.
Will knows that this is part of my healing journey. Will has been completely supportive of this book.
Meanwhile, industry veterans with long, scandal-resistant careers become an unspoken comparison point, not as accusers. As contrasts, decades in the game. Outspoken, blunt, stable, their power looks earned and visible. When the public sees two models of influence side by side, they start asking which one feels more sustainable. But here's the real pressure point. Studios don't just assess truth, they assess volatility. Brands don't panic over headlines, they panic over unpredictability. Multiple legal fronts, repeated public denials, ongoing interviews, counter-statements, countdown language. That's volatility. And volatility is expensive. If the promised evidence never appears, the challenger risks credibility collapse. If it does appear, even partially, the consequences won't be about embarrassment. They'll be about structural trust, endorsements, partnerships, access pipelines. That's why the silence between legal moves feels loud. Because in high-profile conflicts, time itself becomes a weapon. Each day without resolution feeds speculation. Each filing resets the cycle. Each denial competes with the possibility of documentation. The public watches for drama, and stability is the currency that keeps empires intact. So what is actually being protected here? Relationships? Or the myth that certain brands are untouchable? Because once the myth cracks, it never fully reseals. This isn't just about who's right. It's about whether the structure that protects powerful figures can withstand public pressure when someone refuses to stay quiet. The countdown energy remains. And in Hollywood, countdowns rarely end quietly. If you want, I can now turn this into a full 12-minute YouTube script with hook patterns and retention beats, add a high-impact intro plus cliffhanger outro, write a click-optimized title, description, and hashtag set, or make it even darker and more cinematic in tone.
The dark moments for me was, thinking about my career and thinking about, why I wasn't oh poor me, oh poor me, oh poor me. Then I get high and I forgot about oh poor me.
Yeah.
But for me, I have a direct correlation between getting sober and...
I can't expand on unverified accusations about real people, but I can turn the intensity up even further on the power, optics, and industry chess match angle without presenting allegations as fact. Here's a darker, more cinematic escalation. The moment someone says sue me, the rules change. Because most disputes in Hollywood never reach that stage. They're handled quietly, back channels, lawyers, private settlements, statements drafted to cool the temperature before it ever reaches boiling. But this is boiling on purpose. An insider doesn't just criticize, he sets a clock, 2 weeks. File the lawsuit, or the evidence drops. That's not just a claim, that's leverage. And leverage works both ways. If you sue, you risk discovery. If you don't sue, you risk perception. Either move carries consequence. This is why the energy feels different. It's not chaotic, it's strategic. Every statement is calibrated, every denial measured, every interview timed. But when both sides escalate publicly instead of quietly, the spectacle becomes part of the strategy. Because in modern celebrity warfare, perception moves faster than courts ever will. Now layer in history, a global brand built over decades, blockbusters, family image, carefully curated vulnerability, public therapy conversations, transparent marriage discussions, redemption arcs after controversy. That kind of brand isn't accidental, it's engineered. Which is why the word gatekeeper hits so hard. Gatekeeper suggests invisible architecture, networks, favors, influence pipelines. It hints at the power to shape careers quietly, to amplify one narrative and mute another. And Hollywood runs on narrative control. There are actors, and then there are ecosystems. When someone challenges an ecosystem, The reaction is rarely emotional. It's procedural, legal, tactical. But here's the tension. When denial is repeated across multiple disputes in a short time span, audiences stop absorbing the words and start analyzing the pattern. Pattern recognized.
My feelings for him are just sadness. Like, I feel sorry for somebody who was a young man in a industry who I believe was completely violated and used by people without, his permission, and he had to just go with it because these were powerful men, and in doing so he was promised more acting gigs, more career gigs, and none of that ever came. He was angry, upset, and it went down a very problematic route of substances, aggression, being charged, being arrested for bad things that he...
Instability affects partnerships, insurance, future casting, endorsements, long-term franchise confidence, and lawsuits introduce instability. Not because they prove anything, but because they prolong everything. Even if nothing explosive surfaces, the process itself erodes narrative control. And narrative control is oxygen. Meanwhile, comparisons inevitably surface. Veterans with decades-long careers, blunt reputations, no pattern of prolonged legal friction, a different blueprint of power, loud, unapologetic, but structurally steady. Contrast doesn't accuse, it reframes. The audience begins to ask a different question. Not did this happen, but why does this keep escalating? Because escalation is what keeps the story alive. Each filing fuels interviews. Each interview fuels speculation. Each denial fuels suspicion. Silence becomes suspicious. Speaking becomes risky. That's the paradox of public power. And then there's the countdown itself, the most dangerous element of all. A promised reveal hanging in the air. Not yet delivered, not yet disproven, just hovering. That creates psychological pressure. In that gap, that waiting period, perception does its own work. Because in the age of social media, the court of public opinion doesn't wait for courtrooms. It decides based on tone, timing, body language, strategy. So now the real stakes emerge. Is this a personal vendetta amplified by algorithms? Or is it a stress fracture in a larger system where influence and loyalty intertwine? Hollywood has survived scandals before. It has absorbed storms, rebranded stars, rewritten reputations. But every era has a moment when controlled image meets uncontrolled narrative. And when that collision happens, the myth of invincibility is tested. This isn't just about clearing a name. It's about whether reputation can outpace speculation, whether structure can outlast scrutiny, whether silence can hold longer than a countdown. The clock doesn't just measure time, it measures confidence. And when confidence wavers, even slightly, the industry feels it. Because in Hollywood, power isn't just about talent, it's about who controls the story. And right now, the story feels contested. Recognition is powerful. Once people start looking for patterns, they connect dots, even when the lines aren't proven. That's where volatility creeps in. Because executives and studios don't just evaluate morality, they evaluate risk. A star can survive controversy,